So welcome to our webinar for IFTDSS. We're going to be talking about the exposure analysis functionality that we released back in March, and we're really excited about it. It's got some really neat features to it, and we're hoping folks are finding it useful, and hopefully it'll start really getting utilized out there in the fire community, and you guys will be in touch with us on how things are working, etc. So today it's myself and then Josh Hyde, who is he's our manager of our IFTDSS support center. He handles all of the online help and handles most of the tickets and such that come in through the support center. Josh is going to help moderate some of the questions, and I will too as we get going. So thanks, Josh, for joining us. And yeah, good to have everybody. Looks like we've got about 96 folks. We had about 150 registered, so we got a great group today. Really excited about this. Also, I wanted to point out on the right-hand part of the control panel, there's a section called Handouts. And if you take a look at that, I uploaded 2 of our handouts, which are just sort of an overview of both the quantitative wildfire risk assessment and the exposure analysis. And these are both posted on the IFTDSS homepage. You can always download them from there, but I went ahead and attached them here just for easy access. So it kind of just gives an overview of what's going on with both of those features in the system. Let's see. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and run through a couple of introductory slides, and then we're going to hand it over to our presenters today. We have Chris Boldman with us from the Boise National Forest, and he's detailed to the Region 4, Intermountain Region with Forest Service. And Jennifer Anderson, who is the fire planner for the National Forest of Florida, who is also working on a detail for Yosemite National Park. So they're going to be presenting some examples for us today, which we're really glad to have them. But let me, if I can get my screen to advance here. There we go. Okay, hopefully I've switched slides. And you can see that. Let's see. So our outline, we're going to do a quick introduction. We're going to walk through, I'm going to talk a little bit about how the exposure analysis fits into the quantitative risk assessment. Then we've got our 2 case studies, and then we'll talk a little bit about what's coming next in IFTDSS, and then where to find extra information or additional help as you're using the system. So with that, I wanted just to point out a couple things to let folks know sort of how things are going with IFTDSS. We've had IFTDSS out and about now for just over 3 years. We released IFTDSS initially in 2017, and we are up to about 2,200 accounts within the system. So we've had a really great group of folks getting into IFTDSS and using it for all kinds of different things. We're about a 65-35 split between federal users, and 35% of our full count of users are non-federal, whether they're state or academic, nonprofit, and you name it. So we've got folks from all walks of the fire management world utilizing IFTDSS these days, which is fabulous. And we've got folks using it for a whole myriad of things. We've heard from folks telling us about NEPA specialist reports, prescribed fire plans, using the map interface in public meetings, and of course what we're going to talk about today is sort of the early pieces of the quantitative risk assessment. In this case, it's the exposure analysis. So it seems to be a wide-ranging use of IFTDSS that we're hearing about, and we always love to hear how folks are using IFTDSS. So if you have a project you're working on and it's working well for you, please let us know. We really like to hear about these case studies, and it really helps tell the story and gives us ideas as well of how people are using the system. So please let us know if you've got a project that you're working on. All right, so I've got 2 questions for the group. This is a new feature I haven't tried before with a webinar, but I've had it tried on me as an attendee. So I've got 2 questions just to get a little info from our user group. We've got about 100 people logged in. So I'm going to launch this question. It's going to show up on your screen. And the question is, how often do you use IFTDSS? And meaning, are you a brand new user? Do you use it once or twice a year, a couple times a month? You're just learning it, or you use it regularly? So go ahead and answer that poll. And I've got one more question for you after that, and then we're going to jump into a little bit about the exposure analysis, and then I'm going to have another question for you a little later on in the webinar. So yeah, this is great. So I'm seeing responses roll in here, and looks like we've got about 20% new users out there who haven't used it yet. Maybe 40% are in the once or twice a year, about 30% a couple times a month. So this is great. Excellent. Good feedback. Okay, let me let this go for just a few more seconds. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and close that one. Thank you all for responding. And I am going to give another question here. The second one is, what kind of work are you using IFTDSS for? So for those folks who are using IFTDSS, we'd like to hear about what kind of work you're using it for. And again, if you have projects out there in the world and you want to share those with us, please let us know. We've actually turned some of them into some case studies on our online help site so people can get a feel for the different ways that it's being used and lessons learned and such. So that's really great info. So yeah, keep the votes rolling in here. We've got, let's see, about 60% in the fuels treatment planning and prioritization, about 40% for prescribed fire planning. That's pretty cool. 40% in the NEPA world, 18% in research, about 35% or so in hazard assessment, and this exposure analysis. So that's great. Great feedback on that. All right. Excellent. All right. So I'm going to go ahead and close that one up, and we'll do another question here down the road just a little bit once we get through our webinar. I'm going to go ahead and bring up my screen again. Whoops. What I want to go for right now then is to talk, hopefully you guys can see this next slide, which is where does the exposure analysis fit? And that's what, of course, what we're going to jump into here with these case studies. So right now we've released the exposure analysis. You can find it under strategic planning in our planning cycle. And as you can see, we've moved along from working on a burn probability analysis. We've mapped our values. And now we're working on this exposure analysis. It's going to be a combination of those things. So, and that's what Chris is going to start us off with. And basically, we're looking at, where the likelihood of a wildfire occurring tied in with intensity, where our values exist, which can help us make some decisions on planning and futuring out different fuels treatments and such. All right, so that's what I was talking about with the exposure analysis. So you can see it within the strategic plan section, and then where we are sort of along the spectrum of going from our burn probability, map values, and then exposure analysis. And of course, the next step is going to be the risk assessment. We'll talk about that at the very end. Okay, and again, just another schematic of where exposure fits into everything here. Okay. So with that, what I'd like to do is turn the presentation over to Chris Boldman, and he's going to run us through an example from his work on the Boise National Forest and working with the folks in Boise County. So Chris, I'm going to send it your way, okay?
Thank you, Kim. So good afternoon, everyone. As Kim was saying, my name is Chris Boldman. My regular position is District Fire Management Officer for the Idaho City Ranger District on the Boise National Forest, but I'm currently detailed to the Intermountain region for the Forest Service, Region 4, and that's who I am. So this slide that you can see here is showing a wildfire risk map from the Boise County Hazard Mitigation Plan from 2017. And it shows that most of Boise County is at high risk from wildfire, but this map really isn't very useful for prioritizing actions like hazardous fuels treatment projects. And my supervisor, the district ranger for the Idaho City Ranger District, directed me to learn more about landscape scale assessment tools to help engage with our partners to achieve cross-boundary outcomes and reduce risk to communities. And so that's really what led me to IFTDSS in the first place. I wanted to find a landscape scale assessment tool that could help identify the areas with values at highest risk to being impacted by wildfire. Because once we have a common picture of where the values are at risk, then we can collectively make strategic investments to prioritize projects that will reduce the severe effects of wildfire to these values that are important to us. So this is sort of showing like what they had for risk, a map of risk in Boise County, and I think it can be improved upon, basically. So this map shows the land ownership in Boise County. We can see that the landscape is a patchwork of mixed ownership. You can see there in the legend, Forest Service ownership in green and private there in lighter green, and state of Idaho in blue, and so on. One of the cool features of IFTDSS that I really like is that it provides access to the data and the models to all interested users, regardless of agency or organizational affiliation. So federal employees can use it, and our non-federal partners can also use it. On the right-hand side of the screen, you can see the covers of the previous versions of the Boise County Wildfire Protection Plan. And this plan is going to be updated within the next year or two. I've been coordinating with the county mitigation forester, and she's interested in IFTDSS and is considering including the outputs from a quantitative wildfire risk assessment into the next Boise County Wildfire Protection Plan update. You know, I've seen the national risk assessment products and the regional risk assessment products, and they're really informative at identifying risk at a larger scale. But the data that was used in the regional and national risk assessments are really too coarse to use at the scale that I'm interested in, the unit scale or the project scale, for prioritizing hazardous fuels treatments at the forest or county level. And I realize that's not what they were designed for. And so, as I said, my goal in learning more about IFTDSS was to find the best available science to prioritize and then strategically place fuels treatments where they can have the biggest impact at reducing risk to the values. I was interested in finding a tool that could incorporate local weather and value inputs, and where the landfire fuels data could be calibrated locally and used at this finer scale for informing fuel treatment project prioritization at the unit scale. And IFTDSS was designed and built exactly for this scale. This slide shows the exposure analysis fact sheet from the IFTDSS page. I thought it was useful for explaining sort of the timeline and where I am in the process. So as it says on the fact sheet there, and as a reminder for folks, exposure analysis is an assessment of wildfire hazard, likelihood, and intensity where highly valued resources or assets are located. And to run an exposure analysis in IFTDSS, you need the landscape burn probability model outputs and an HVRA set for the same extent. And I've been following along as the development of the quantitative wildfire risk assessment workflow has been developed in IFTDSS, and I've been learning how to work through each step as it has become available. And so I already had worked through the earlier steps that are necessary to get to this point in the workflow. When the exposure analysis functionality was released, I had already simulated fire for the Boise County and generated the landscape burn probability outputs, and I also had mapped the values to create an HVRA data set. So in the next couple of slides, I'm going to show you what the outputs from these earlier steps look like for Boise County, and then help explain where exposure analysis fits in this workflow. For the landscape burn probability piece, you need to enter fuel moistures and wind speed and direction. And I wanted to use a transparent and repeatable methodology to determine realistic fuel moistures and wind direction inputs. So I used Fire Family Plus to generate a wind rose for this area, along with percentile weather reports showing fuel moistures at different energy release component thresholds based on historic weather data from the RAWs, the remote automated weather stations in the area. Then I used the fuel moistures at the ERC extreme range to get an idea of what the outputs would be for extreme conditions to come up with a realistic worst case scenario for planning. The IFTDSS Online Help Center has some good references for some other methods of determining appropriate wind and fuel moisture inputs for your burn probability run. I just wanted to show you guys one way for making an informed decision about these inputs, because they're necessary for completing the landscape burn probability piece. And then I'm going to show you coming up how you need the landscape burn probability outputs as you go through the exposure analysis workflow. Okay, so this map shows the burn probability outputs for Boise County. And as a reminder for folks, burn probability quantifies the likelihood of a fire occurring under a fixed set of weather and fuel moisture conditions. And you can see what inputs were used on the right-hand side of the screen. And this map shows the burn probability outputs with red for the higher burn probability and ranging down to blue for the lower burn probability. This map shows the conditional flame length. And reminder of what conditional flame length is. That's an estimate of the average flame length for all the fires that burn a given point on the landscape under a fixed set of weather and fuel moisture conditions. So this map shows the conditional flame length classes with the flame lengths greater than 12 feet shown in red, all the way down through the full range of flame length classes, down to flame lengths of less than 2 feet shown in blue. This shows the integrated hazard matrix, which where you can see how the two outputs that we just looked at, burn probability and conditional flame length, can be combined into a single characteristic that can be mapped, integrated hazard. Here's a map showing the combination of those two elements and the integrated hazard for Boise County, with red being the areas of highest hazard and blue being the areas with the lowest hazard. I like this graphic here because it helps illustrate the big picture idea of what exposure analysis is. And as a reminder for folks, exposure analysis quantifies the landscape burn probability model outputs where they overlap with the highly valued resources or assets, HVRAs. And the HVRAs can be mapped independently and then overlaid with the integrated hazard map to get a measure of exposure for each HVRA that we're interested in. This slide lists several examples of HVRAs. You could run exposure analysis, including whatever HVRAs you're interested in. But for this example, I only included a few values in the HVRA data set because I wanted to keep the scope simple for this example with Boise County. So I limited the list of HVRAs to communities, infrastructure, and surface drinking water. All right, this slide shows the map value screen in the IFTDSS user interface. And for this example, I used data from the national data set that's available in IFTDSS for communities, but you could import your own data set if you had more detailed data that you wanted to use. So in the IFTDSS interface here, I use the drop-down menu to select a primary HVRA category, communities, and then I use the checkboxes to select the sub-HVRAs for high, medium, and low density communities. The next HVRA category I included was infrastructure, and I used the drop-down menu to select the sub-HVRAs that I wanted to include, like power lines, communication sites, buildings, and so on. And then the third HVRA category I included in this HVRA set was surface drinking water. And I, again, use the drop-down menu to select the primary HVRA category, municipal drinking water there. And then I use the checkboxes to select the sub-HVRAs. And I included all of the categories of surface drinking water from the national data set that range from low to high importance. So here's what the exposure analysis user interface actually looks like in IFTDSS. And remember I was saying that the exposure analysis requires landscape burn probability model outputs and an HVRA set for the same extent. Here's where the user can select those outputs from the earlier steps in the workflow for this exposure analysis piece. So here I selected the landscape burn probability output that I'd already completed from the drop-down menu for Boise County. And then I also, after you select that, the map auto-populates with the selected landscape burn probability model outputs. And then next I selected the HVRA data set that I wanted to use from the drop-down menu. And once the HVRA set is selected, then the system checks for intersections and populates the map with the HVRA set information so that the user can visually verify that the proper HVRA set is selected. Yep, and that looks right to me. So after I selected that, after I selected the landscape burn probability output that I wanted to use and the HVRA set that I wanted to use, I was able to just scroll down, give the exposure analysis a descriptive name, and then click Run. And then after the exposure analysis is run, you can see the outputs in the Map Studio. So here you can toggle on or off the different outputs like burn probability, conditional flame length, or integrated hazard. On the screen now is the integrated hazard, and then you can zoom in the Map Studio to areas of interest. And just to orient you guys, because you're maybe not as familiar with this piece of ground as I am, down here we have Idaho City around here, Centerville's up here, and Horseshoe Bend's over here. Up here we've got Garden Valley, and then Lowman is up here. So that's what those communities are there. Areas that we're interested in my area, my district, and also in Boise County. So this slide, I wanted to point out that IFTDSS has the feature that lets the user upload shape files. For example, I uploaded the shape files for ongoing fuel treatments and ongoing timber sales. And it's useful to view them in Map Studio like this, because then we can see where they are in relation to the communities, in the screen capture of the map viewer in IFTDSS. And then on this slide, I have the integrated hazard outputs from the exposure analysis turned on as well. And I also have Boise County, the boundary for Boise County turned on, so we can see where that is, to give people kind of an orientation of where they're at, what they're looking at. And remember, this integrated hazard layer is a combination of the burn probability and conditional flame length outputs, as the matrix in the lower right-hand corner of the screen shows. And these outputs can be used to help prioritize hazardous fuels reduction projects, and then also document their selection process. After you submit the exposure analysis run and it processes, you can also generate an exposure analysis report. So here's just screen captures of some of the pages from the report. The report has a cover page, and then it's got different sections summarizing different components of the exposure analysis. For example, the landscape burn probability section of the report includes the header information with the descriptive details about the run, and then followed up by the landscape burn probability maps. And those are the maps that I showed earlier with the outputs for burn probability, conditional flame length, and integrated hazard. All those maps are included in the report. I didn't duplicate them here. You've already seen what those look like, at least in the Map Studio. Also, the exposure analysis report has different sections, such as the primary HVRA summary, which presents bar charts and the table summarizing the landscape burn probability outputs for the burnable pixels within the landscape, or the extent the analysis was done for. And then it also, later in the report, has a HVRA summary statistics table at the end of the report, where it includes all the summary statistics in one place. There's also maps of the HVRAs that were used. For example, here's the map from the exposure analysis report to give a big picture perspective for the community's HVR data in Boise County. You can see from the legend that most of the communities in Boise County fall into either the low density category, which is shown in red, or the moderate density category, shown in purple. And so for those of you familiar with this area, some of the communities that fall into this low density are Horseshoe Bend, we got Roby Creek, Idaho City, we've got Placerville and Centerville, Garden Valley, and then Lowman. So that's the communities. And this is the map from the exposure analysis report to give a big picture perspective for the infrastructure HVRA data in Boise County. And one feature I really like is that users have the ability to download the exposure analysis outputs for use outside of IFTDSS, because HVRAs with very small extent relative to the landscape, like structures or communication towers or trails, they may be very hard, difficult, or impossible to see in this exposure analysis report map image. But the data is there in IFTDSS, and it becomes more noticeable when you zoom into an area in the map viewer in IFTDSS, or another geospatial viewing platform that you can download the output data into, like ArcMap or ArcGIS Online. This is the surface drinking water HVRA map from the exposure analysis report. You can see in the legend the different colors for categories of surface drinking water importance, from the highest importance shown in green, extremely high shown in brown, very high shown in red, and very low shown in purple. And again, you can view this info in the map viewer within IFTDSS, or you can download the exposure analysis outputs for use outside of IFTDSS. The map and the reports good for seeing the spatial arrangement of the surface drinking water HVRA layer across the landscape, but I find it really more useful, for me at least, when I can view this in a viewing platform where you can adjust the transparency of these layers and then view the exposure analysis output in relation to the HVRAs and to other data like proposed fuels treatments. So fortunately, after the exposure analysis is run and processed, you have the option to download the outputs for use outside of IFTDSS. There's a download button that you can click on, and you'll see a window once your download request is processed. And then you can save the files to wherever you would like. The IFTDSS Help Center describes the steps for importing layer symbology into ArcMap for the landscape burden probability outputs. So once you have the output data saved to your computer, you can create a map using your own GIS program. For example, I created this map in ArcMap, and I uploaded the HVRA data from IFTDSS and also added the polygons for the current fuels treatment projects and current timber projects. And so we can see where those are in relation to the exposure output for the HVRA of interest. In this case, I have turned on the community's HVRA layer. And IFTDSS uses a specific color scheme for Map Studio. When you download the IFTDSS files for use in ArcMap, you can duplicate this color scheme by using the layer files contained in the symbology folder. And that's how I was able to add the integrated hazard layer symbology from the exposure analysis outputs into ArcMap. And there's quite a few steps to this process, but there's a topic in the IFTDSS Help Center that will help walk you through this yourselves. On this slide, you can see that I was able to publish the exposure analysis for communities in Boise County to ArcGIS Online. By creating a story map or a web application, this is an example of a web application in AGOL. That could be really useful because people from different agencies could then view this info. If I gave them the link to this web application, they could then themselves toggle on or off the different layers, and zoom in or out to the areas that they're interested in. So I see a lot of potential with this type of common operating picture for identifying areas where values are exposed to wildfire. And I think it could be really helpful to collectively target areas for fuels treatment projects and for coordinating projects with partners, especially on a mixed ownership landscape like this. And so then, instead of each agency just striving to achieve X number of acres randomly scattered across the landscape, I think there's a lot of potential for creating synergy with our partners in strategic collaboration for reducing risk from wildfires by planning projects adjacent to one another to treat the landscape as a whole. And we could use AGOL to have a common operating picture with our partners so we can coordinate, collectively plan treatments for the lands where we each have the authority, and the result would be a more coordinated effort for reducing the risk to the values that we all care about. The IFTDSS quantitative wildfire risk assessment workflow gives us a transparent and repeatable methodology for explaining the process used for identifying areas for potential projects and prioritizing, and to explain then how we prioritize different hazardous fuels treatment projects. And the outputs from IFTDSS can also help support grant proposals for our non-federal partners for projects in the areas with the highest risk. For example, there's several grants the county could be eligible for that have as one of the criteria must be adjacent to federal land where fuels reduction projects are occurring or are pending to be treated within a reasonable time frame, or must have a WUI component to protect communities at risk. So I'm excited about the possibility of planning hazardous fuels treatments projects with our partners to collectively treat the landscape as a whole rather than each agency working in isolation. Smarter, safer, and more effective fuels treatments are right in alignment with the tenets of the National Cohesive Strategy. And I really think capitalizing on these emerging technologies can help us to engage in meaningful dialogue with our partners and can help us to collectively mitigate risk to the values important to all of us. Earlier, I had mentioned that I have been coordinating with the Boise County Mitigation Forester. I just wanted to mention for this example, I used Landfire 2014 data because when I went through the burn probability step when it was first released last summer, that's what was available. But since then, the Boise County Mitigation Forester has been learning to use IFTDSS also, and she's working through this process with the newer Landfire 2016 data, and I'm really looking forward to seeing her results. I'm really excited about these tools, and I see a lot of potential for land managers and also for the wildland firefighting community, because this type of strategic planning will not only help reduce the risk for the values across the landscape, but it will also make the landscape safer for the firefighters who are called on to protect those values during a wildfire. This is still a work in progress, and we're all learning as we go. But I think this map that's on the screen now could help us to make more informed decisions for prioritizing hazardous fuels treatment projects across the landscape than the first map I showed at the start of the presentation. I'm really looking forward to the full quantitative wildfire risk assessment workflow being available later this year. This is my last slide, and I hope this was worthwhile for folks to get an idea of one example of how IFTDSS is being used.
All right. That was fantastic, Chris. Thank you. Great example. Really good, super applied use of these tools. And like you said, lots more to come as we release some more things here down the line, which we'll talk about at the end of the webinar. So with that, what I'd like to do is go ahead, Jennifer, I'm going to go ahead and make you the presenter. And Jennifer is going to present another case study. This one comes from Yosemite National Park. And she's been working with the folks there. So sort of complementing Chris's presentation with a little different spin on using the exposure analysis to do some prioritization in the park. All right, Jen, so we can see your screen. I think you're good to go.
Great, great. And you can hear me okay?
Yeah, you sound good. Very good.
Okay, great, great. All right, well, good afternoon, everybody. Like Kim said, I'm Jennifer Anderson. I'm the fire planner for the National Forest in Florida, and just finished up a detail with Yosemite National Park. So it allowed me to play around a little bit with some of their projects and data. So today I'm going to share with you some preliminary steps in a fuels treatment prioritization process using the exposure analysis in IFTDSS. So to recap, an exposure analysis is an assessment of wildfire hazard where HVRAs are located. In this example, we're going to compare differences in exposure to HVRAs to assist in fuels prioritization. There are multiple variables to consider when prioritizing your treatments. And by conducting an exposure analysis in IFTDSS, it allows you to consider hazards, which is two of the three building blocks of assessing wildfire risk, as one of those variables. With limited fuels budgets, it is important to assess fire risk and estimate how much risk reduction we can achieve through particular treatments. So you've seen this slide from Chris's presentation, the scales that IFTDSS addresses. And for this example, I'm going to focus on the unit level, which is best for project planning, prioritization, and risk reduction. Some of you may have used or created fuels prioritization models and know that there are many variables to consider. And some of these include, but are not limited to, highly valued resource and assets. You may not have referred to them specifically as HVRAs, but this includes things like natural and cultural resource, wildlife habitat, water quality, vegetation timber, and assets, WUI, communities at risk, wreck sites, other man-made structures, which is something that is considered in fuels treatment prioritization. Another variable that's often considered is fire return interval departure, or FRID. When was the last time that area burned? This helps in keeping habitats in their desired conditions. Another variable would be using historical fire scars or other treatments on the landscape. This could be prescribed fires, mechanical treatments. Working with your partners, conducting cross-boundary burns, another important one. There's internal program collaboration, working with your program leads, such as resource, cultural, and recreation programs. And then last but not least is hazard and risk. So you may have assessed hazard and risk in other ways, but now you can use IFTDSS to complete an exposure analysis that assesses the wildfire risk where these HVRAs are located. And an EA is required step in the quantified wildfire risk assessment process, which is currently being built in IFTDSS, like Kim and Chris said. So for today, we're just going to focus on the HVRAs and hazard considerations to begin the prioritization process. So our study area is Yosemite National Park, and these are some of their burn units in the valley and along the western and southern boundary of the park. So now in IFTDSS, in the cycle, this is the strategic planning tier. So to start this, you can create your HVRA set based on a landscape you've created, a landscape burn probability output, or an area of interest. For this example, I first created a landscape burn probability without any treatments applied to the landscape. Then I created a customized HVRA set based off the same landscape. You can use the provided national data sets that are in IFTDSS, but you can also upload your own data sets, kind of like Chris said. So some of this might be duplicative, but just so you know that you do have those options. The last step was to create an exposure analysis to analyze the exposure to the HVRA set. So after I did this, I went through this process 2 more times, applying the planned 2020 through 2022 treatments, and then some additional treatments based on the results of that outcome to compare the different outcomes. Okay, so these maps are here showing the results for your burn probability, your conditional flame length, and your integrated hazard, which of course combines the burn probability and the flame length, with all the Yosemite burn units using the initial landscape. So this one has no edits. So just looking at this visually, you can see which units have the greatest hazard. At this point, you could use this for prioritization, but it doesn't take into account your HVRAs. So next, I built a customized HVRA data set, and I used air quality, communities, recreation, infrastructure, ecosystem function, wildlife, and surface drinking water. And these are in no particular order. One thing to remember is when identifying your HVRAs, you want to include your analysis to limit this list to those of the highest value. So next, I ran an exposure analysis with the initial landscape, and this is a snapshot of the exposure analysis results for the primary HVRA data set using the landscape before any treatments were applied. We'll take a look at a full report here in a bit, but for now, we're just going to look at the mean burn probability, the mean conditional flame length, the mean integrated hazard, and mean burn probability and mean conditional flame length. These bottom 2 are the same graph, the same data, it's just shown in different graph formats. So you can see that the HVRAs in the mean burn probability and the integrated hazard are within between the low and the middle classes. And the conditional flame lengths range from 2 to 6 foot flame lengths. These results are also available spatially in the Map Studio, which we'll take a look at later. So next, using the planned treatments that the park had for fiscal year 2020 through 2022, I modified the landscape and ran the landscape burn probability and EA based on the same HVRA data set. So these dark areas are the units that they have planned for the next 3 years. And here again, we have the maps for the burn probability, the conditional flame length, and integrated hazard with the 2020 through 2022 treatments applied. So it's a little difficult to see here in the screenshot. So again, we'll take a look at IFTDSS here in a minute. And here's another snapshot of the exposure analysis results using that same HVRA data set with those treatments applied. And again, we're looking at the same things, the mean burn probability, the conditional flame length, and the integrated hazard. And you can see from these graphs that the HVRAs and the burn probability and integrated hazard still rank between the low and middle classes. And the flame lengths are still within the 2 to 6 foot flame lengths. So then I looked at the reports and I looked at the results spatially, and I chose these based on a few different reasons. Using that integrated map in those units, and I also looked at some recent fire scars and made a decision to pick these 3 additional units here in gray. So again, you're looking at the same burn probability results with the proposed treatment. So this really can visually give you a lot of information here. So again, to recap, I applied the 2022 treatment to the landscape, and then I applied these proposed treatments. which gave me these results. So again, we're looking at the same outputs, but they're a little bit different here. You're looking at your mean burn probability, conditional flame length, and the hazard. But here, the difference is they all rank in the lower classes, and the conditional flame lengths range from 2 to 4 foot flame length. So there was a bit of reduction. So now that I've shown you the 3 reports separately, let's look at these figures side by side for comparison. So these figures are the burn probability for the EA output. And you can see here that in the first 2 figures, the pre-treatment and the 2020 through 2022 treatments, there are very slight changes or reduction in hazard. But if you compare the proposed treatments to these, you can see that the burn probability is reduced in almost all of the HVRA classes. This is the comparison for the flame lengths. Again, slight reductions in the pre-treatment and the planned treatments, and in most cases, in the proposed, within a foot difference of flame length. However, modest reductions in air quality, ecosystem function, surface drinking water, recreation, and wildlife are most apparent in the proposed treatment. Lastly, this is the integrated hazard comparison. When you combine them, the results show that the greatest reduction in hazard is in the surface drinking water and wildlife. The thing to note here is that surface drinking water and wildlife dropped to an overall lower class. They both, one went from lower to lowest, and the other went from middle to lowest. This is the actual data that goes with those graphs. So when you compare the outputs here, the slight reductions are easier to detect from the pre-treatment to the 2020 planned treatments and the proposed treatments, although only slight differences in some of the HVRA categories. Focusing on the integrated hazard, I'm going to point this out a little bit easier so you don't get lost in these tables. Focusing on the integrated hazard, the wildlife HVRA stayed in the middle class, where in the proposed dropped to the lowest class. And in the surface drinking water, the hazard class dropped from lower to lowest. If those were critical management issues, then this could demonstrate to leadership that the additional proposed treatments would be necessary to reduce the overall integrated hazard. With only 2 of the HVRAs showing a reduction in hazard, I probably want to run some additional scenarios to see if those choices would result in more hazard reduction. As promised, we'll go into IFTDSS now, so enough PowerPoint. So give me 1 second and I'll pull it up, and I'll just kind of walk you through what I'm going to show you. I'm going to walk you through just some of my thought process here based on the landscape where I had applied the 3-year, the 2020 through 2022 treatments. So just to kind of give you an idea, so here's the park boundary, and I've got I'm going to zoom in a little bit. I'm in Map Studio. I'm not going to walk you through each, every way, how to get here exactly for the sake of time. But anyway, so here we're looking at those units over here, and these darker purple units are the actual, the planned treatments, not the proposed, because right now I'm in the step of going from planned to proposed. So I have also turned on, so I'm going to turn off the boundary so we can see this. So now I have the integrated hazard layer turned on. So this can kind of give you a visual of where the integrated hazard is on the landscape. So from here, I can turn on these different HVRAs. And just to give you an idea, let's see, so communities, I have some low density and moderate density. So those kind of start showing us out here. So that'll give me an idea of where that is. If I wanted to zoom in a little closer, I can also use this swipe tool, which is pretty nice. I can get it to open up. There we go. And so then I'm looking at communities. So now I can swipe here, and I can see where those communities fall on this integrated hazard. So then maybe I want to look at, remember, wildlife was one. So let's go turn on some wildlife up here. Okay. And then I'll need to change that over here in my swipe. There's wildlife. So now I'm looking at wildlife with integrated hazard. So you can see that I did pick this unit over here, which does have some of that wildlife. Remember, that was one of the ones that completely reduced and that went down from the middle to the lower class. So even just that little bit of habitat in there caused that kind of reduction. So I went through each of those along with the report, which we'll look at in a minute too. So I looked at, let me take off the swipe. So after looking at all the HVRAs, now I'm really messing things up.
Oh, that's okay, Jen. You're doing fantastic.
There we go. I don't know what I did there. Okay, so lastly, you know, I did mention when you're thinking about the prioritization, right? Some of the things you could also consider is fire scars. So let me turn a couple of these off so we can look at. So I have some of the fires that occurred that could still be used in planning those treatments. There we go. I'll get this together here. So the problem with going live, right? You have techie issues or user error issues.
It's always a little scary, but you're doing great.
Oh boy. All right, well, this loads. I did consider this as well. So I looked at all the different HVRA layers, and I looked at some fire scars, and then looked at areas where those planned treatments that we had planned for 20 through 22. So with all that in mind, I looked at, and I also used the report. So with all that, that's how I went and chose those three. So just because I picked those three doesn't mean that's the right answer. I would, now at this point, I want to go back in and try some alternate, scenarios, pick some other units, see if I can get some of those classes to drop more, or, to reduce the hazard. So real quick, I'm getting close on time here. Chris mentioned the reports, and we showed you the analysis. So I had some of those screenshots out of them. So this is the full report here. Let me make this bigger. It gives you all kinds of outputs: the burn probability, the conditional flame length, the integrated hazard, the summary, which is what I showed you in the slides. But then it breaks it out for each HVRA, so you can actually go in. And you can use the map for visual purposes, but you can also look here for the actual data. So using those in combination is how I made those decisions. So let me go back over here. Uh-oh. Okay. So in conclusion, we are not done. Now that we've compared a few different scenarios, we can continue to run additional exposure analysis using different burn units. And what I shared with you today is the first couple of steps in prioritizing fuels treatments. Like Chris said, you can download this data in a GIS or even upload your own data to IFTDSS to look at, your fire return interval departure, additional HVRAs, historical fire perimeters for additional spatial analysis. You still need to collaborate with your internal programs and meet with your partners if the units are along the boundary, which there are a lot of opportunities there for us to do some boundary burns. After completing the EA, this will put you in a good position for the next step, which is the quantitative wildland fire risk assessment, in which you'll need to continue collaboration with your partners and internal staff. These outputs can also help you paint the picture of what you could accomplish with more funding and objectively quantify the expected outcomes to proposed treatments, while demonstrating that you use the best available science to assess fire risk and estimate how much risk reduction you can achieve through these particular treatments. So now, Kim, we'll talk about what's coming this fall, the quantitative wildfire risk assessment.
Excellent. All right, Jen, that was great. Nice job going live, too. That's always a little bit precarious sometimes. So
that was tricky.
Way to be brave.
Thanks.
Good work. All right, great example, Jen. Thank you so much for sharing that. So I'm going to go ahead and grab the screen again. We just have a few more minutes left here. And I've got one more poll question, if I can make it work. Hopefully, can you guys see that poll question yet? Okay, looks like you guys can. So this is the have you been tasked with, or do you plan to work on a hazard, exposure, or risk assessment using IFTDSS potentially, or maybe not, maybe other, maybe other options out there. But obviously, we're hoping this quantitative risk assessment that we're progressing on will be the tool of choice, is what we're shooting for. And again, we do want to hear from folks as it progresses along, how it's working for you and such. And I'll show you how you can do that as I get here the last couple slides before we end the webinar. So, okay, thanks guys for voting. Okay, there you go, just for fun. Everybody can see everyone voted. So that's great. We're glad to hear that. And we're excited to show you what's coming here. So let me go ahead and do that. So the quantitative risk assessment is, let me put this in a larger screen mode here. Okay, there we go. So this is next, and we're using GTR 315, which is the sort of the framework that a lot of these risk assessments are built on. And the idea is to work through the process that Jen and Chris have outlined, and then we'll add the next steps to it, including the outcomes of both losses and benefits associated with fire. And I think oftentimes we let the benefit slide. Sometimes we say risk, and people forget that there is a benefit that can come with fire as well. So the quantitative risk assessment does include that benefit. So we'll be working in this corner of our diagram over the next several months. We'll move from exposure to risk assessment, where we're going to be dealing with response functions and then the relative importance of those HVRAs. So these are the things we're going to be doing come fall that should be available to folks. Not exactly positive on the time frame yet, but we're working through things. Things are going very well, actually. Going through definitely the first 5 or 6 bullets up here, and then adding in response functions, relative importance, and then looking at those outputs, and then getting reports as well. Just like we showed with the exposure analysis, there'll be accompanying reports with the risk assessment as we go. And here's a quick sneak peek. Don't tell anybody, this is under development, but this is a few screen captures from our development system. Again, things could change a bit over time as we work on this stuff, but you can see we've got some, I know it's hard to see, but some places where you can actually enter in your figures for each of your HVRAs, for response function. And then we'll have the same thing for relative importance, which is over here on the left, and then some breakdowns, and you'll be able to really analyze kind of your inputs on, and then be able to work with folks as far as collaborating and discussing these things. This is supposed to be done in a collaborative manner. So trying to make it so these results and inputs could be shared and then changed and adjusted as discussions go on. So then the last thing I want to just quickly talk about is where to find help in IFTDSS. And so I'm going to switch over here to the IFTDSS homepage. And basically, we've got all kinds of links on the homepage here. Anything that's new will always show up here kind of on the left. And hopefully the next time we do one of these, it'll say risk assessment. And you'll have a number of things that you'll be able to select from on the homepage here. Under user support, we have a fantastic help center, thanks to Josh for maintaining and managing that. Always adding new stuff as things are added to the system. So you can find pretty much everything you need here. We've got our tutorial videos. There's a link to our webinars. This goes to our YouTube page, our YouTube site, and we're going to be adjusting that a little bit since we moved to Microsoft. There's other resources in here, like here on the left, there's some case study examples. Anything you need to know about the modeling is under the modeling menu here. So it's really easy to navigate and find things. And then the last thing I wanted to show you is the user forums. And we really like folks to use this. If you have thoughts, questions, ideas, fabulous place to go and read through other people's questions and answers, as well as posting any ideas you have for us. Because we're constantly gathering ideas from folks as far as what's coming next in IFTDSS. So with that, we've hit the top of the hour, and I want to thank our presenters, Chris and Jennifer, for a fantastic job. We hope you have gotten something out of this as far as what you can do with exposure, and then what to look forward to in the coming months with the risk assessment. And we'll keep you posted. We'll get this recording uploaded for you an email sent out of where to find it and some of the questions and answers that we had today. All right. So with that, everybody stay well, stay healthy, and we'll be chatting again with you probably in a couple months. Have a great summer.